Hello, everyone. Today, I'm really excited to introduce Sulabh Jain from Chariot Palmistry from Australia. He has his own YouTube channel where he makes different videos monthly on different transits, and he does palmistry readings as well. And he's here to talk about Ramayana and how it's embedded with astrology and palmistry. Welcome, Sulabh.
Yes, thank you very much, Nav. Thanks for welcoming me here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, it's great. It's always nice to meet like-minded people into Jyotish and that space, especially all around the world.
Yes, yes. And I had a great reading with Sulabh as well on palmistry, and it was really, I really resonated with a lot of information and is great. The reading was amazing. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
Yes.
So today I'd like to talk to you and your followers about the Ramayana and also about like the hidden code of astrology and palmistry that's inside it. So shall we jump straight into this?
Yes, yes, please.
All right, awesome. I'll hit the share screen. Okay, perfect. You can see the screen right now?
Yes.
All right, great. So I wrote a book a couple of years ago, and you can see it just behind me, just over there. It's called Valmiki Astro-Palmistry, the hidden code of astrology and palmistry within the Ramayana. And the Ramayana is, for those of your followers who may not know it, it's probably one of the best works of literature in all of human history. That and the Mahabharata probably go shoulder to shoulder for the #1 title there. But this book has the meaning of life for literally everyone who's ever been born and ever will be born. And the reason it's able to do that is because the author of the story, Valmiki, he embedded a code of astrology into it. And that's what I'd like to be showing you guys today, a number of techniques that are outside traditional Vedic astrology. So let me show you an example here. If you have a look at someone's birth chart and you want to know what is the primary source of suffering that this person will have in their life, then according to the Valmiki system, what you do is you count the number of houses from the natal sun to the ascendant. Okay, and it's just that simple. So for example, if there are 3 houses between the sun and the ascendant, then third house matters will cause suffering to that person. And that's things like siblings, communication, businesses, all that sort of stuff. And as another example, if there are 5 houses between the sun and the ascendant, then it's 5th house matters that will cause suffering to that person. That's the studies, the children, boyfriends, girlfriends, that sort of thing. And in a little while, I'll explain how the characters in the Ramayana give this exact same teaching, but this is a very simple technique. If you, as an astrologer, look up somebody's birth chart, then within seconds, you'll be able to say, this is why this person's suffering. And then you can figure out how to heal that suffering.
So
and the technique that.
Yeah. So
basically,
So basically, like the first slide, it's basically that was the main focus or main suffering in their life. Like that's how we can find out. So for example, if someone has sun in the 11th house, third to the ascendant would be, so the 11th house sun counting to the center would be third, right? That's how we're looking
correct.
to find the suffering. So if somebody
That's right.
has 12th house sun, that the cause would be themselves because.
Well, it'd be the second house.
Second house, okay.
So from 12 to the ascendant, so the family, the foods they eat, any financial assets they accumulate, that will cause them suffering. But if the sun's in their ascendant, then it's their own lack of self-awareness that will cause their suffering.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. But then the question becomes, how do you heal that suffering? Because it's not enough to say you've got this thing that will hurt you. We've got to tell you how you can fix it, because that's the real gem of astrology. You can use it to solve problems. And the way to do that is you count the number of houses from the ascendant to the sun. So we do the opposite before. It was sun to ascendant. Now it's ascendant to sun. So to take your example, if the sun's in the 11th house, then it's matters of the 11th house that will heal your suffering. That's your friends, earning an income, your father's side of the family, those things. As another example, if there are 9 houses between the ascendant and the sun, then ninth house matters will heal your suffering. That's your father, your teacher or guru, and your spiritual practices. And so a very simple thing is you look at the dynamic between the ascendant and the sun as to what will hurt you, and then also what will heal you.
Beautiful.
All right. So the big question then is, what does this have to do with the Ramayan? So it's very good to look at that as a technique, but let's drill into the story itself to see how we got those techniques out of the story itself. And the first thing I want to say about Valmiki, the author of the Ramayan, is that he was actually a very, very famous palmist. All the ancient Mahadishis, they had their own schools of astrology and Jyotish and all this stuff. Valmiki was famous for being a palmist. And when he wrote the Ramayan, he wanted to write it in such a way that it contained the meaning of life for everybody, everyone who's ever been born, everyone who was alive at his time, and then everyone who will be born into the future too. So as I said before, when he wrote the Ramayan, he achieved that feat by putting astrology into it, because astrology does have the meaning of life for everyone. And this is a code that's hidden in plain view. So I'll give you two simple examples. Why did Ravana have 10 heads? If you read the story that says Ravana has 10 heads, but they don't actually go into why that is. So from a palmist's perspective, there are 10 fingers on the hands, and each one of his head represents a different finger.
Okay.
Why did Kumbhakaran sleep for 6 months at a time? In the story, Kumbhakaran is the younger brother of Ravana. He's this giant demon, and he goes to sleep for 6 months at a time. They mention it in the story, but they don't really get into the detail of that. The reason for that is when Jupiter goes retrograde, it goes retrograde for 3 months, then it takes another 3 months to return to its original position. So that's 6 months. And Kumbhakaran's sleep is Jupiter not behaving the way it normally does, if that makes sense. So let's drill into this and look at the actual lineage of astrology here. There's a character in the Ramayan called Vashisht, and he's famous in Indian folklore for doing 3 things. Number 1, he wrote some of the verses in the Vedas. Number 2, he was a teacher of Rama. And these are the 2 things that he's most famous for, his Ramayan connection and also his Rigved connection. But he's also famous for a 3rd thing, which was he actually is the monk who delineated the zodiac system. So he looked at the sky and he said, this constellation of stars is Aries, this constellation is Taurus, and this is Gemini. It was Vashisht who did that. And he had a famous grandson called Parashara. And as astrologers, I'm sure you know, he's the father of Vedic astrology. But he didn't just invent it, he got part of it from his grandfather. And Parashara is famous for that, but he's also famous because he was killed by a demon. And that's not really relevant to this story, because that the way he died, that set off a sequence of events that ended up with the Mahabharata story in that conflict. And again, that's off topic, but we won't go into that. The reason I mention that though is Parashara had a son called Vyas. And Vyas is famous, A, for being an astrologer, but B, for writing the Mahabharata. And Vyas had a student called Gemini, and he's the other foundational pillar of Indian astrology. So if you look at that lineage from Vashisht all the way down to Gemini, that's the astrology that most people learn. And at the very top with Vashisht, it started out as solar astrology. By the time you get to the bottom of that lineage with Gemini, it's solar and lunar astrology. Somewhere along the nakshatras were added in, and they weren't there up at Vashisht's lineage. But outside of that school was another great monk called Pulatsya. And he's famous. Well, we don't actually know a lot about him, but the little we know about him are for 2 things. Number 1, he's the grandfather of Ravana. Number 2, he had his own system of astrology, but his astrology was all based on the moon. And so if you look at Vashisht as being like a solar astrologer or sun-based astrologer, Pulatsya, he was a moon-based astrologer. And so the whole system of astrology, one thing astrologers in India have been debating for thousands of years is what's the best form of astrology? Do you look at the moon and its houses, or do you look at the sun and its houses? And there's pros and cons to each one because both give really, really good predictions and they're both really accurate. So it's hard to say that one is better than the other. So this whole conflict, so to speak, this whole discussion or debate is written into the Ramayana from the lens of Valmiki, who isn't an astrologer at all, he's a palmist. And so one way to look at the Ramayana is Vashisht as the teacher of Ram versus Pulatsya as a teacher of Ravan. It's actually solar astrology versus lunar astrology. And the whole story ends with Pulatsya's lineage being completely destroyed. And whatever there was to learn from it gets absorbed into Vashisht's lineage. Okay, so have a look at Ram and his followers. So from a palmistry perspective, Ram represents the right thumb, or the thumb on the right hand. And there's constant references to him in the Ramayana of this. So for example, when Ravan tries to kidnap Sita, the first thing he says is, well, first he tries to seduce her. So he says, Ram's a weakling, he's weaker than my thumb, which is like a really weird way to seduce someone, right? And then when Hanuman goes to Lanka to meet Sita, at first she doesn't believe it's him. So he has to convince her that, you know, he's a messenger from Ram and he's not like a messenger from Ravan. And what he says is he starts to describe Ram. He says he has lotus eyes, he has broad shoulders. He also says he has 4 horizontal lines on his thumb. And again, that's a very weird reference unless you're aware of the palmistry and astrology that goes into all of this. So that is the right thumb, and he's constantly referred to as he with, like, you know, 4 lines on his thumb and so on. But then he's got 4 followers who are always around him. There's Hanuman, which is the index finger. And in astrology, that represents Jupiter. And if you think of Jupiterian qualities or traits, they map onto Hanuman perfectly. Hanuman is the only monkey in Ram's army who can expand his size. The way Jupiter creates expansion. Is extremely wise, just like Jupiter. And more to the point, Hanuman is actually the grandson of Jupiter. His father, Kesari, was the son of Jupiter. So Brahaspati had 2 children in the Ramayana. One was Kesari and the other was Tara. And Tara married, I think, Bali. And then when he died, she married Sugriv. So Hanuman's like directly within that Jupiter lineage. His brother, Lakshman, is the middle finger. I won't stick the middle finger up, but it's that one over there. That's the Saturn finger. And if you look at Lakshman, he's got all the qualities of Saturn. He's an outcast, he does all the hard work and gets little to no reward, and he's equally as powerful as everyone else in the story, but no one really recognizes him that way. Ram's other brother, which is the ring finger, is the sun. Well, that's the sun finger. That's why when Ram went off into exile, Bharat was left as king or as like a vassal to Ram. So he's got all the solar qualities. He's a king, but not really a king. And then his younger brother, Shatrughan, is the pinky finger, and that's Mercury. That's why the only time you really hear about Shatrughan in the story is when he's being sent off on diplomatic missions or when he's doing things like in a Mercurian nature. So for Ram, thumb, and then he's got the 4 brothers hanging around him. And if you look at Ravan, he also had 4 brothers too. So Ravan is the thumb on your left hand. Hang on, I'll stick it up that way. And he's got 4 brothers too. Kumkaran is the Jupiter one. So he maps onto Hanuman almost exactly. You know, Hanuman can become a giant. Kumkaran is a giant. Hanuman is wise. Kumkaran is extremely wise, and so on. But whereas Ram represents the ascendant, Ravan represents the moon. And I'll show you some examples and passages out of the Ramayana where Valmiki is constantly referring to him as, you know, being as radiant as the moon and so on. But Kumkaran is Jupiter relative to the lunar ascendant. So what you do is you make the ascendant where the moon house is, and then you track Jupiter off of that. Then Vibhishan maps onto Lakshman almost exactly too. So as in he's Saturnian in nature. He's an outcast in his own family. He's equally as powerful, but no one respects his power and that kind of thing. And Ravan had 2 other brothers, Kar and Dushan. So Kar, like Bharat, was Ravan's vassal. He basically was a king in a jungle looking after part of Ravan's territory. And Dushan is Ravan's youngest brother, and you don't really hear much about him in the story, just like you don't really hear much about Shatrughan. So you've got the four brothers of Ram and the four brothers of Ravan, and you can see how their interactions with each other represent different planets interacting with each other too. But there are two other main characters in the Ramayana too. That's Hanuman and Sugriv. So if you look at Hanuman, there's a form of him known as Panchmukhi Hanuman, which is Hanuman with 5 heads. You know how Ravan had 10 heads? This Hanuman has 5. And each one of those 5 heads represents a different finger. And if Hanuman is Jupiter, then he's the Jupiterian ascendant. And those 5 heads represents a different planet relative to Jupiter. And Sugriv, when he went into exile, he took 4 allies or friends with him. He took Hanuman, Jambavan, and Nil and Nal. And each one of them represent similar characters to Ram and Ravan too. So I'm giving you lots and lots of different characters here, but I'm just laying the foundation for the story.
Right.
To answer the question, which is the best form of astrology? Is it solar or lunar? You've actually got to have a look at all 4 of these characters, because Ram is known as the great souled one. He's Paramatma. And from an astrology context, he's the ascendant, because it's off the ascendant you figure out where all the other houses are in the zodiac and what your karma is through each house. And Ravan is the moon, Sugriv is the sun. And by the way, the reason Sugriv is the sun is because in the story, he's the son of Suryadev. So not only is it explicit in there, but every time someone looks at Sugriv, they say he's as radiant as the sun, just as they say Ravan is as radiant as the moon. And Hanuman is Jupiter. So you've got 4 separate ascendants. So from a palmistry perspective, 4 separate thumbs. So the question then is, which is more important? The big answer is that Vishnu has 4 hands. And Ram is the form of Vishnu. The magic to all of this is you actually have to look at all 4 planets and all 4 ascendants. So it's not that solar astrology is better than lunar astrology or vice versa. You've got to look at both of them. But then you've got to look at the sun and you've got to look at Jupiter too. Is this making sense so far?
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
All right, perfect. So I'll read you out a passage of the Ramayana right now. And this is from when Hanuman first meets Ravan. And just keep your ears up to when all the astrology references happen here. But for those of you who don't know for those of you listening who don't know the Ramayana, basically what happened was Ravan kidnapped Sita, took her to his island hideout in Lanka, and Hanuman was sent in to find her. This passage, it happens when Ravan is asleep in his room, and Hanuman sneaks in there. He's like a monkey who can fly and shrink in size, and he's hiding in a corner of Ravan's room, spying on the demon king. And what the Valmiki Ramayana says is that at one point he enters Ravan's house and sees in his bedroom a white umbrella that is decorated with the best flower garlands and resembling the moon. Hanuman approached a sleeping Ravan but became very gloomy and moved away, deciding to observe him from a corner of his room. From this distance, Hanuman noticed that Ravan had thumbs, fingers, and palms with good symbols, along with other auspicious markings on the demon king's body. The women that surrounded Ravana in his chamber had faces that were as radiant as the moon. Hanuman realized that Sita was not in Ravan's palace and so searched the rest of the city for her. That's the Sundarkand. Again, you can't read that without constantly having this lunar reference thrown at you over and over again.
Right.
And just by the way, Hanuman coming into Ravan's home, think of Ravan as the moon. And the home of the moon is your lunar ascendant, right? It's your lunar house.
Right.
And if Hanuman represents Jupiter, that's Jupiter transiting your lunar house.
Mm-hmm.
And you look at the effect that that transit had on Ravan's life. It says here that Hanuman became very, very gloomy and moved away. So you think of the moon as all your emotions. You think of Jupiter as being the rational part of your life. You know, it's your education, it's, you know, the other hemisphere of the brain. And so when that rational part of you becomes very gloomy and it wants to get away, it's a sign of the moon overpowering Jupiter temporarily. because later on in this passage, Hanuman completely destroys Lanka and Ravana's home. So what that transit actually represents is Jupiter overpowering your emotions. And just as it destroys Ravana's home, it destroys your emotional well-being too. In astrology, people talk about the Saraswati as being one of the worst times in your life. Well, that's Saturn transiting into the lunar house. But Jupiter transiting in there can be just as bad, but it only happens at an emotional level.
Okay, interesting.
All right.
Yeah.
Let's come back to that technique I was talking about before, where we were trying to find the primary source of suffering for someone. And this happens when Sugriv first meets Ram. So remember, Sugriv is the sun, and the sun is your ego, and it's your desires and what you want to achieve in the world. Whereas Ram is the ascendant, is what will actually happen to you in the world. So one is what you would like, the other is what actually happens. It's reality. And so reading a passage out of the story, after parting with Shabri, Ram and Lakshman journeyed to Mount Rishyamukha to find Sugriv and ask for his help in finding Sita. And upon seeing the two brothers approach, Sugriv becomes very nervous, fearing that they are spies sent by his brother Vali to kill him. He flees his mountaintop home and asks Sugriv to disguise himself and approach the strangers in order to find out who they are. So think of the sun as being, as I said, all your desires. And when your desires meet reality, your desires get pushed away because your higher nature doesn't care what you want, doesn't care if you want to drive a Lamborghini, it'll give you the Toyota that you want, right? And similarly, that's the primary source of suffering that we go through in life. It's all based off our ego, as opposed to, well, I mean, the ego is our thoughts about ourselves. And we see that through the sun. The sun wants to be the center of the universe. It wants everyone to orbit around it. Right. And we can see that through Sugriv and Ram. Sugriv is technically the king in the story, although Ram has power over him throughout the whole war. So let's look at an example of this one. Over here, we've got somebody who's got their sun in the second house. So if we were to have a look at what is the primary source of suffering that this person will have, it's seventh house matters. So things like relationships, their spouse, business partners, that kind of thing. And the way to heal that is to count from the ascendant through to the sun, which is 7 houses too. So this is a difficult energy, meaning that their ego will constantly be put down by their spouse, but they'll be healed internally through their spouse as well. And that's a tough challenge for a lot of people. They don't like to be put down, but in being put down, they're healed as well.
Right.
Yep. Here's another example, sun in the second house. So if we go from sun, count all the number of houses way back to the ascendant, that's 12 houses. And so it's the 12th house represents isolation, going to jail, being in hospital and things like that. And so throughout this person's life, they'll constantly feel down about being isolated. So the question then is, how do you heal that suffering? And you look at the sun in the second house and say that it's second house matters that will heal that suffering. So through their family, through building financial assets, they overcome that. Just as Ram ultimately ended up helping Sugriv, he got his kingdom back, he helped him achieve this great victory. The Ram does heal Sugriv, but it's Ram looking at the sun as opposed to the sun looking at the ascendant, if that makes sense.
Right.
So now I want to show you the birth chart of Sri Ram. This is actually mentioned in the Ramayana. And again, if you read the Ramayana just from a story point of view, you'll read this passage where he talks about Ram's birth chart and where all the planets were that he's born. And you won't quite understand what that means. But as astrologers and as Jyotishas, we should read between the lines. So this is Ram's birth chart. And we can see that he's got the sun in the 10th house. The 10th house is, actually we should count from the solar ascendant to the actual ascendant, and that's 4 houses. The 4th house represents the mother and the home. And Ram was sent into exile by his stepmother and he lost his home. That's his primary source of suffering, because it's really after that point, the story of the Ramayana really kicks into high gear. So the question then is, how does he heal that suffering? And sun in 10th house means it's 10th house matters, like his career, that will eventually heal him. So Ram was born to be a king, but he was also born to kill Ravan. And so through that suffering, he killed Ravan, then eventually got his kingdom back. Do you see how that works?
Yes, yes, works beautifully, actually. It's giving you cause of suffering as well, the solution of healing, which is beautiful.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. So we're skipping over a lot of the fundamental system here because we're not looking at all the big characters in the Ramayana. I'm just giving you like this ascendant, which is Ram, and Sugriv sort of interaction here. But I do want to talk about a transit because this works with transits too.
Okay.
So you don't just look at the fundamental birth chart, you can look at different transits that take place. And this is this passage of the story where Ram kills Kar, who is the brother of Ravan.
Mm-hmm.
So remember, Kar represents this finger, the ring finger on the left hand, which is the sun. But it's the sun relative to the lunar ascendant. So just as Sugriv and Ravan have their own interactions, when they fight in the war and when they have their discussions, it's the sun to the moon. This version of the sun through Kar is like the sun being subjugated to the moon. So I'll read you out the passage and then we'll see if we can figure out what this means. And again, as I'm reading it, keep your ears open to all the solar references in here. So the story goes, after the death of Dushan, Kara decides to attack Rama himself, riding into battle in a chariot that equaled the sun's radiance. Kara attacked Ram with such ferocity that the gods and celestial beings appeared in the sky to witness the battle. At one point, Rama's sun-like armor was destroyed, and Kar was able to pierce Rama many times with his arrows. In retaliation, Ram shot an arrow at Kar's flag and brought it down as if the sun god fell down to earth. Ram then shot 13 arrows at Kar that dazzled like the sun and destroyed his bow, horses, chariot, charioteer, and weapons of war. Kar then picked up a mace and hurled it at Ram, but he deflected it with his arrows. Kar then threw a tree at Ram, but his attack was also deflected. Ram then shot an arrow into Kar and killed him. That's out of the Aranyakand. So again, constantly Valmiki is saying this passage has something to do with the sun, and you can't mistake it if you actually pay attention to it. Mm-hmm. So let's have a look at what's going on here. The sun and moon are actually opposites. You know, one rules your inner world, your emotions and your subconscious, and the other rules your outer world in terms of what you'd like. But both are subordinated to the soul, which is the ascendant and which unites these planetary influences. So when the sun transits the ascendant, then it will be empowered. And this in turn will diminish the effect of the emotions on a native because the sun starts to become dominant. Mm-hmm. And this happens for 1 month every year, basically when the sun goes into your zodiac house of your ascendant. Mm-hmm. At that time, the sun starts to overpower the moon. So if you have a moon that's incredibly strong and it's weakening your sun, mm-hmm. this is the 1 month of the year that you can start to reverse that energy and do your sadhana, do your spiritual practices to make that transit or the effects of that transit become more permanent for you.
Lovely.
All right. And that's basically the end of the presentation there. I'll jump out of the screen share just so we can get to some questions on this. Do you have anything you'd like to ask on that?
Well, this was a different perspective. And with these examples, like I mentioned earlier in the video, that I had applied it on my chart and few people I know, and it makes like a lot of sense. Even the healing part and then the suffering part, like I've applied it before on few people's charts too, including mine, and it works so beautifully. So it was a beautiful presentation.
Oh, well, thank you. And as I said, it's from a system of astrology that's outside the mainstream Vedic astrology. So it's within the bigger umbrella of India culture and heritage, of course, but it's just from a different school.
Right. And do you have these books, like, are you also selling this book online, or if somebody's interested in purchasing?
Oh, yeah. So you can get it from our website at chariotpalmistry.com, but you can also get it off Amazon and all the other big bookstores. It's an ebook format and paperback too.
Okay, that's great. And you also do, like, I know you do the palmistry consultation. Do you also do an astrology consultations as well online?
Well, actually, I do it all off palmistry, because
Okay.
through this Valmiki system, you can actually reproduce the birth chart from the lines on the hands. So we
Okay.
didn't go into that in this presentation, but we do talk about it in the book.
All right. All right. So I'll leave your link below for our viewers, and they can check out your website and also your YouTube channel, where you do different videos every month on the transits and prediction monthly, which is really nice. And most of them, I think you also mark them, right? And
Yeah, I do.
yeah, so those are nice. And you also talk a lot about stock markets and cryptocurrency as well on his YouTube channel. So in future, maybe we can do a video on a stock market as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Sulabh. And I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you guys have any questions, please leave us a comment below. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.